Hello, everyone. This is Scott Hardy with Top Class Actions. I've got Tom Ball with Alert Communications that's going to be walking us through this great presentation today. I would also like to say thanks to Colin Beard and the Beard Group for hosting this and making this all happen. So, Tom, I'll be passing the baton over to you. Of course, for all the participants, if you have any questions, please make sure to ask them in the Q&A. We'll go ahead and answer these questions for you throughout the presentation. Tom, what you got for us?
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it. Just kind of go through this now. Appreciate you being on here too and being the moderator, and thank you, Colin, as well, and the Beer Group. And what we're going to talk about today is the best practices really for qualifying and assigning a class. And this is really just the efficiency that sits around how the leads flow and how you handle these to make sure that you never basically miss a case that is valuable for you. So we're going to go ahead and just charge straight into this and see where we go. First of all, what I wanted to talk to you about is a general business strategy. Really, the typical general business strategy for any business is you have the company. It really doesn't matter if it's Coca-Cola or Corona Beer or Ford Motor Company. What you then have is really marketing, and then you have sales. And really in any business world, when you're clicking in all cylinders in all three of those departments, you generally have a successful business. And you can actually operate those and just really look at honing those in. So the thing we want to talk about here is in the class action business strategy, what you have is the law firms, and then you actually have the class action itself and that litigation that you're looking at. And that's really kind of the product combined. And then what you have is effective marketing, which is really going out to the class reps. And then what you have is 24/7 intake services, which is basically with contract services, which is part of the important part basically is actually converting those leads basically into your class action reps under your law firm. Now, as a class action overview, which most of you know, we're going to go through this. The class action examples that we're talking about are consumer products, which give you false claims, slack fill, homeopathic products, submissions, claims, whatever. A lot of those different things. Then TCPA, that would be part of that. Employment law litigations, fraud, which could be labeling issues, financial insecurities, and then COVID-19, which actually encompasses business interruption, failure to refund, PPP claims, etc. So those are the type of things we're talking about. And when we look at this process being simplified, the class actions kind of go-to-market strategy are this. You have basically, first of all, the litigation selection and the budgets that are associated with going to basically acquire these cases. Then you have basically your firm alone, meaning that you're going to try these cases, or you're going to do this with co-counsel, and they may be part of the leadership team. Or basically, then what you have is marketing. Either you're going to do this marketing internally or with vendors or a combination of both. Then you have the intake screening, the qualifying, and the retaining of the clients. And then you file those cases, you have your docket evaluations, you have financing, maybe play a part in this. We're not going to really talk too much basically about filing cases, the docket evaluation, or financing. We're going to stay on the first 4 bullets here and get deeper dive in how to actually acquire these cases. So the class action strategies that exist today are mass arbitration, filing by state or by federal, alone or with co-counsel, and then target states, meaning legal friendly jurisdictions where you're going to file these cases in based upon the type of litigation that you're involved with. And then the supportive legislation or laws or statutes, and also the venue that we're looking at. And Scott, did you want to chime in here at all?
Yeah, I think it's important to note here that with all of the mandatory arbitration clauses that we see in these agreements trying to waive the rights of class actions, we're seeing more mass arbitration take place in law firms. And by having the ability to handle large amounts of clients signing up and working with an intake strategy with Tom or another group here, that's a way to get around these class action waivers, is that, you know, the intake group can get these folks signed up and you can proceed on an individual claim basis as long as you've really automated and got your intake down to an exact science to make that mass arbitration actually cost effective for those cases filed.
All right, thank you for covering that. So now let's go to the next one and let's talk about marketing branded versus not branded, and really what that would mean in your advertising.
And so touching on that, for the most part, on the class action side, you're going to have a lot of different, it's not like the mass tort or the PI side where you've got these lead generators that are just, having some kind of broad name on there. In general, our experience at Top Class Actions is that the attorneys want to make sure that their law firm's listed. They're very concerned about making sure all of the advertising is ethically acceptable. And that's the number one question I get when I talk to different class action law firms is, Scott, is the advertising ethically acceptable? And so in general, on the class action side of it, you'll see that most of the law firms that are doing the advertising are including their law firms, their law firm name on the advertisement. They're also including an individual at that law firm that is responsible for the advertisement, and making sure that the advertisement is ethically acceptable is, ridiculously important. This boils down as well once the case is filed, because if there's any question upon if the advertising was not acceptable, then defense counsel will come in there and try to get your lead plaintiff thrown out, try to get the case thrown out. So you want to be extremely careful on this.
Thanks, Scott. So when we talk about, the type of advertising that's out there, there's generally on the offline advertising, there's the TV, there's radio, there's billboards, and that really just is reaching a wide audience that may know nothing other than the fact that they may have a legal issue related to the advertisement. And then there's also this side, which is the online advertising or digital advertising or forms of web advertising, where you have social media. They may or may not be familiar with your company or brand, but within the class action, it's more likely that they are. There's detailed filters that allow marketing focus for the initial screening as well, that are happening digitally before they even get to the intake. There's organic in the SEO, where leads have expressed some interest and they're actually searching through a query. There's pay-per-click, and then there's also pay-per-call. And those basically found your call to action intriguing enough to investigate. And either they want to talk to somebody right now or they want somebody to call them back, and they're going to make that selection. So these go ahead, Scott.
So it's important to note here, like if you're using Top Class Actions for the advertising, that we can tie in directly to Alert Communications. We could work with Tom and his team to make sure that as those leads are coming in, it could be hundreds of leads, it could be thousands of leads. And we have the qualifying questions and the script down pat. So Tom's team knows who to reach out to, who to file away that's not qualified, who to aggressively go after and potentially sign as a potential lead plaintiff, to make sure that your dollars are spent in the most effective way possible. Does that sound right there, Tom?
Yeah, it does. And basically it becomes an outbound effort most of the time, except for on pay-per-call where it becomes inbound. But on the outbound effort, it's a significant effort with repeated attempts to basically get the person on the phone, then to go to screening and qualifying, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And basically the intake and the initial response that is put together here is really based on the ad. With branded advertising, it's focused on the litigation and branding the law firm at the same time. And it may be required based on whether it's a class action or not, even for ethics, but also because of certain state bar requirements absolutely require that it be a branded ad. And that can actually be run state, locally, or basically national advertising used to do branded advertising. In the unbranded side, that's generally national advertising, not focused on branding law firms, but really to elicit a response to an ad only. We see this all the times on the TV side. We see them in radio. We also see those in digital, and we probably see that mainly more unbranded in the mass tort side. But it's not always that way, and it really just varies in the strategy and also ethically how the law firm feels responsible to do the advertising. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get going here.
Exactly, Tom. And that's super important here with these law firms that are running these ads, is that you want to make sure that the marketing group you're working with is very familiar with it. For example, in Florida, if you're running an ad on top class actions, we need to have your law firm name both at the top of the page and the bottom of the page. That's what's recommended by the bar. So we'll call that out and say, hey, this is what we recommend you do. You, as a customer, have the right to change it around however you want, but it's important that whoever you're using to run these ads has some familiarity with the different state bars, so you don't get into trouble with your state bar. And of course, down the line, once your case is filed, the defendants don't have room to try to gripe at you about that either and get your case thrown out.
Right, and the way that changes on the intake side and how we respond is if it's branded, we may be actually answering as the law firm in your behalf and then saying, are you calling basically about the business interruption case or something like that? Where if it's unbranded, we were specifically mainly answering the phone saying, hey, are you calling about the business interruption ad, and then going straight into the intake and qualifying criteria. And what would happen is later on through the intake and qualifying process, they're going to learn about the law firm as we actually go toward trying to convert them into a client. So let's talk a little bit about cost per acquisition, which is known as CPA in this industry. The campaign budget and the lead flow really is going to determine intake bandwidth that's needed. And I'll give you an example of that. The most amount of plaintiffs I think we've ever signed in a single case was we signed 24,000 plaintiffs up for a single law firm for a single campaign over a 3-month period at high volume. And what happens basically is for a law firm, their budget, if they come and say we have a $50,000 budget or $100,000 budget, that's a lot different than $1 million budget or multi-million-dollar budgets to go after, because really it starts to dictate what you do within your own law firm. Like, can you even handle intake internally at all? And in high volume budgets, you really can't. And also in advertising outside of time windows as well as bandwidth, which we'll get into. So let's talk a little bit, take a deeper dive into this. So when we talk about the budgets and the lead costs, the lead source and the budget type really impacts the lead flow and required staffing, which we're just going to call bandwidth. Meaning, how many people do you have internally to take all of these calls or to make outbound calls in an immediate fashion 24/7 instantly internally? And if you don't have that, that's when basically we usually are actually involved with helping law firms and helping marketing firms to make sure that no lead is ever missed. So TV and radio, which is unique in that, which is creating this inbound flood, those calls come in all times a day, even in the morning, which is 24/7, 365. Now we're open 24/7, 365, but it really requires inbound instant response, which means you really can't delay in getting these. So if the phone's ringing to you, around the clock staffing, the correct bandwidth, and everything is designed so the calls are all picked up in 3 rings or less. We do know what happens in ring number 4 is impatience starts to set in. Ring number 5, which is another 6.5 seconds or so, people are wondering if you're even open or if you can even handle this at that time, or if your office is open at all. And on ring 6, you start to, 5 and 6, you start to get abandoned calls, people hanging up because they really don't think you're responsive. And that's just the impatience in our society and how you have to really build around that. Now, web leads are unique because they require immediate outbound. And the outbound is probably a little different than just making a phone call. We have found the most efficient, and just so you know, we do millions of intakes per year. And what we found is that after measuring millions of intakes with web leads, what was the statistic if you call them right now when the web lead comes in? And you think, oh, we're going to get them on the phone right now, but it's not true. You only get them about 40% of the time on the call with an immediate call. So what the goal is that if we have automation, and what you want to really do is text them immediately to respond to them saying, thank you for contacting our law firm. We are interested in talking to you. Please expect a call within the next 5 minutes. And that's designed to keep them from filling out multiple web submissions on multiple law firms. So the text goes first, then an immediate outbound call goes to them. Even with that, you may only get them around 40% of the time. So you have to do follow-ups and scheduled tasking, which requires software. And this is where it really gets complicated, where law firms basically say, do we even want to do this in-house? Because the way this works, especially at volume, is that if the call comes at 10 o'clock in the morning and the person is doing that at their break at work and they don't really want the call right then, when you call, they're not picking up. So our system will task ourselves to call us about 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and it'll do that. And even through a weekend, and we get a lot of people at nighttime and weekend because of that. So it tasks our people to resend a text and make another phone call out. And that is the minimal lead loss and the highest conversion. So it takes multiple touches. When you do it that way, that conversion into live intake A lead into live intake goes from about 40% effectiveness to about 80%. It doubles that, which is a game changer when you look at marketing return on investment. And then when you're mixing media sources, which means that you have individual campaign sourcing, tracking, measuring, and reporting, which means basically if you were using top class actions to do digital leads for you, and they were pouring all these in, but you also decided to go do TV and radio, you want to measure those independently, not at the same time, and get those conversions dialed in to look at the effectiveness of both of those. And you track those, and they actually take a different type of effectiveness, or even multiple different campaigns. So if top class actions actually said they several different landing pages, you wanted to measure each one, track, measure, and then have reporting that actually shows the effectiveness of all of those. When you go to Spanish speaking markets, this requires a unique team and approach. About 65% of our floor, and just so you know, we have 425 people and about 55,000 square feet. And we'll talk about that more later, but about 65% of our floor is fluent in Spanish. And when you're talking to the Spanish market, culturally, as well as the length of call, it changes. It's can be a lot more conversational, and the length of the call can actually be longer, and you have to be prepared to actually be able to have a team that can do that. So if you're doing specific campaigns to Spanish speakers, and that's the language of their heart, then you need to reach their heart with intake as well. Do you have any comments on that, Scott?
No, you made a lot of good points there, because you covered it. The number one complaint that we get from our clients is, Scott, we've been trying to reach out to this person and they're not calling us back. And so our answer to that is, how long did it take you to call them back? And as Tom mentioned, did you text them? Did you email them? And when you have alert and you're working with someone like Tom here, then all of that's automated. And you can be guaranteed that if they answer those qualifying questions correctly, so you know they bought that product, they said, yes, I bought this product, yes, I had this problem, and yes, I want to serve as a lead plaintiff, that's a super qualified person. And you want to be aggressively going after them to go to the next step and get them signed. You don't want to miss out on getting that ideal lead plaintiff. And having this process in place is so important and can make the difference between you being able to spend those advertising dollars wisely and get that person signed up, or having to run the exact same campaign a month later because you weren't able to be in front of those folks as soon as they submitted their information and you possibly lost them.
All right, thanks, Scott. So now let's just talk about intake bandwidth and how critical this is, and how this really just equals more cases and lower CPA and your acquisition costs. So when we really look at this, this needs to be right sized for the campaign or outsource, and this is what we're talking about. So the best way to look at this is just illustrate it. When you look at a funnel, trying to capture every single lead and be able to respond to every lead, not just the fact that it's come to you, like a web lead comes into you and you call them tomorrow, but the fact is you can respond right now to them. The funnel on the left really shows that. And why this is important is because in the marketplace, we hear, well, as long as I get 70% conversion, of the people coming through of the qualified cases to sign up buyer, I'm actually happy with that. And the fact is, it's actually kind of a statement that's made in error. And the why is just the knowledge about it. So if you look at the left funnel, we try to design our company that no lead is ever missed for anybody that we work for. And so you could say we responded immediately to all 600 leads, and we signed 140 out of 200 qualified leads for a 70% conversion. Yes, that's a correct answer, because no lead was ever missed on the top of the funnel. But if you look at the funnel to the right, which could be your intake team within your office, it could also be somebody you may be outsourcing to, they still could claim 70% conversion, because out of the 70 out of 100, instead of 140, they missed 70 people of qualified leads. They signed them and they still got 70% conversion. But the fact is that what happened to all the leads they missed? Well, the leads they missed basically are gone, technically marketing for another person. So the bandwidth of how you build an intake team, and also making sure that's actually designed around the type of campaign, whether it be digital with the outbound bandwidth you have to actually react right now and make multiple attempts, or TV and radio, which is instantly being able to pick up the phone, is critical, and how little time you have. So let's talk about that as well. Let's talk about intake versus marketing and the cost realities of both of those. So when you really look at this, intake versus marketing cost realities, really about 5 to 20% of your entire case is the intake cost. And we're saying that because the fact that in class action, the intake cost can be even lower, into the 5% realm, and 20% could be what it could be, basically depending on the intake screening criteria and how you're trying to screen people out. And then 80 to 95% of the cost is marketing cost. So when you look at the cost per acquisition physics about this, if you blow the intake, or you can't react by intake, but the leads are still flowing, it's extremely costly. The marketing cost then increases with bad intake. And what happens basically is that all the cost per acquisition of all of this changes. And what we commonly see with a lot of law firms is they just spend their way through this problem. And what they do is they just keep on spending more money in marketing to actually create more leads. And if they lose some leads, they don't worry about it because they're still getting cases to actually work on, versus getting every single case. And we just don't think that strategy. And we talked about the business model at the beginning. You know, you have basically your product, and you have effective marketing, and you have the sales, which is really intake for a law firm. That should be dialed in all forms because it releases more marketing capital to go after more clients or other campaigns.
Tom, I'd like to
go ahead.
Cut in here for a second. Here we got a question from Pat Lester. Pat's a client of both of ours, actually. And he asked if this was being recorded. And so, yes, the answer is yes, it's being recorded. And I'm sure that Colin and the Beard Group can work on trying to get some copies out to you if you are interested. Of course, if you have any other questions here, please make sure to submit them to us. Colin also let us know that this presentation will be going to YouTube. So we'll make sure to send out a link. Colin will send out a link to all the attendees so you can view it at your leisure. Thanks, Tom.
No problem. So now let's talk about lead response, timing, and quality, and how critical this is. So the lead response times are super critical. And what you need to know is ask yourself is, do you know what your firm's average ring answer time is for calls? We do know over 3 rings, because we've measured millions of intakes, leads to abandoned calls and really lost leads, which means basically it's lost marketing revenue at that point. And also, do you have an overflow system beyond 3 rings, which means that there's another way to actually manage over 3 rings. And what we have found basically is if you actually put a recording there, which basically says after 3 rings, hi, this is ABC Law Firm. We're very interested in talking to you about your case. Please stand by. We'll be with you in just a few seconds. And that overflows to, let's say, alert communications. That's what we do, is we take overflow calls like that. But you put a recording in between, you'll lock them down. If you say you're going to be with them, you actually lose more people pushing it over an overflow and it just ringing 4 or 5 and 6. So an overflow system actually should be in place. So even if you have a robust intake team during the day, you should have an overflow system over 3 rings to go to somebody else that can help you out in those situations when you have high volume or unexpected high volume coming in. You should also know your hold times. So if you're going to use an overflow system, or you're ever going to do a hold time, and it doesn't matter what type of lead it's for, you only really have about 15 seconds maximum, which is about another 3 rings before that results in abandoned calls and lost leads. This is something we've measured extensively to try to raise conversions and actually build our team around. And that overflow outsourcing after 3 rings of a message is what we just talked about, what really works best to solve that. And we can talk to you more about that if you ever want to just reach out to us. But also, you also need to know how fast your team responds to web leads. So when you're qualifying web forms and they're in landing pages or chat, it doesn't matter how the lead's coming in a web lead. What really is required is instant texting with automation, meaning that portion is that if a web lead comes in, they're automatically texted, that goes out. And it goes out with prompts. And did you want to talk about that, Scott, about the prompts at all?
So it's really important as we're talking about these different leads that are coming in, and that we have those qualifying questions set up, because a lot of these different class actions could generate thousands of leads. You know, we've run different campaigns that were generating 5,000 plus leads a month. And so when we've got those coming in, Tom's team doesn't need to call every one of those back, right? Tom's team just needs to call back those who are super duper qualified. Otherwise, you're wasting money on, you know, you're spending money that you don't need to spend. And so by working with people like us at Top Class Actions and working with Tom's teams, we narrow down those qualifying questions so we know exactly who needs to be called back and who shouldn't.
Thanks, Scott. And really what you have is after you send a text to people saying that you are going to call them, you have about 1 to 3 minutes to really get an outbound call out to them. That's what is ideal. After that, the likelihood of them sending out, because you've now created interest and looking for other forms to fill in for other law firms, is pretty high. And the lead loss becomes significant over 5 minutes. And we have some data to talk about. So let's just talk about slow response, how it equals lower conversions. This is a statistic that was done actually for InsideSales.com for MIT. It was talking about in the first hour calling the same amount of leads. They actually reached 12,700 people, but the same amount of quantity of people that they reached out to 2 hours later after the lead came back. So the first hour, you can look at the quantity. Second hour, the fall off down to 1190. That's all they could reach. 3 hours, 299. So you can imagine when you get back to leads the next day, or if it's Friday night and you call them on Monday, where are you getting that lead? And in this world, the legal world, that lead is probably already signed or engaged with another attorney firm, or is deep down the road with them to making that happen. Now, this even becomes more significant here. Same study. This is response time from creation by 5 minutes. So the odds of making contact decrease over 5 times in the first 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, you can see that 9,000 people were reached. The same group of people called, in 10 minutes, they could only reach, maybe 1,800 or so, 15 minutes. Look at the fall off. Look how fast you have to react to get to people these days with leads. That's why, especially with web leads, you have to immediately respond. And it's the same thing really with an inbound call, even organic coming to your website. You don't want them leaving messages. Somebody needs to be talking to them right away. And this just shows how quick you need to respond to make sure your marketing dollars are working best. So the elements of responding to a lead, let's talk about reaction time again. This is actually a Harvard business study. And this talked about firms that tried contacting a lead within 1 hour were nearly 7 times more likely to qualify the lead versus those who waited 2 hours. The problem that we actually found with the study is, oh, great, you reached them. The problem we see is that this only measures how many leads lead to a meaningful conversation with the key decision maker, and you contacted them within the first hour. Well, the problem in this industry is that it's not really talking about conversions. And really, if you don't reach them within 5 minutes and you actually go into a meaningful intake at that point, likely you will reach them if it's late in the first hour, but a lot of times they may have already signed with another law firm. So, but this is just impressing the point that how fast you need to respond to people to make sure the lead stays at home with you and your marketing dollars stay home.
And it's important when you're looking at these reaction times, because on the class action side, you might be the only law firm that's advertising for this case right now, unless you're doing a large, general TCPA violations, people just getting unsolicited text messages. There are a number of law firms that are handling that. But if you've got a very targeted advertising campaign where you're saying this specific product didn't deliver and you're looking for potential plaintiffs, it's still important that you're calling these people back immediately. Our most successful campaigns when we're working with our clients, they have people that are calling them back immediately. They're sending out the text messages like Tom's team does. They're emailing them. They're doing all of that to get those folks signed up while it's fresh in their mind and they want to be engaged. Even if this isn't something that, it's not a mass tort where you're competing against 100 other or 1,000 other law firms, being able to reach out to that person quickly will make a huge impact on if you're able to get that person signed. And of course, on the class action side is how quickly can this case get filed? That's so important. If you want to be lead counsel in this class action and other firms are looking at filing this case, having that intake set up correctly could be the difference between you being lead counsel and not.
Thanks for that. And really that reaction time equals happy clients. What we mean by that is a lot of times you just have to really think about what does a client want that calls in or reacts to an ad. They really just want you to respond. So they don't care if they're putting in a web form. I'm sure all of us have been frustrated where we've actually submitted a web form for something that we just don't ever hear back from the people, or it just comes down so late you've already gone down another path. It is the same way with these clients, but it's a great way to start off with a great client for you. Is if a web lead comes in and there's an immediate response to them, they're like, great, and I'm going to get a call. They get a phone call right after that, or it's a time set up for them to talk. They're happy. If the phone's ringing through and somebody picks up the phone, they've gotten what they want. They want they're reacting to an ad and they really are calling for somebody to talk to. They get somebody to talk to. The questions are there. The intake screening criteria is there. You're asking questions specifically about what they're interested in, and you end up with a result at the end. And what happens basically is that if you look at the study, that 3% of callers gave up before the phone was answered, 11% of calls lasted less than 10 seconds, which means they were just dropped calls because they weren't handled correctly. And 42% of the time, law firms took 3 or more days to respond to a lead. We see this all the time. And really what happens is that it doesn't mean you won't be a successful law firm, but you're less successful. And you could actually be having all of those leads coming directly to you because the fact to have intake kick in to make sure you patch all the gaps is not as expensive as losing the marketing dollar and losing these leads. So the potential solutions are to correct your intake team structure if you think you're missing leads, but you have to be able to measure that in the first place, or outsource to actually help yourself out. So the first impression of leads is also critical. I was just asked the other day, you know, what is your training process, which is months with our agents, and our training book is probably, I don't know, 8 inches thick, but it's pretty significant how to train to actually do this for intake. But you standardize how leads are greeted. You must maintain consistency with guidelines, monitoring, listening to the calls for training. It's pretty significant ongoing process, but to have an intake team take care of all this, not just standard greetings, but calm, and also with empathy to deal with people with what they're going through. And remember that multitasking staff really weakens the intake. So what happens basically, if somebody is really a busy person preparing for some other case or some other deadline, doing some other job, and it doesn't matter if it's an attorney or a paralegal or an office person, an administrator or an intake team, that pressure actually comes out in their attitude and their voice tone. They have a rushed impression, they have patience basically, and that patience really lacking to the client calling in, and the time of the intake becomes shortened. And what happens basically, that client feels that, and it doesn't give them that warm and fuzzy feeling you need. So that first impression is critical, and having people trained to always be in the right mindset. And that first impression is, you know, you really don't want voicemail to be the first terrible impression to them. It just shows you're too busy or don't care. However, the overflow voicemail with 15-second or less hold, that thing we talked about before, that system, if that's built right, it does work really well to hold them. And remember too, the intake is really responsible for shaping the lead's understanding and feelings about the law firm and the litigation. So even though they may be concerned about the litigation, they really also need to trust you. And that actually happens through your listening and being empathetic to their situation. So you really always need experts taking your calls, doing the intake for you. And you really need somebody who's managing them, that can measure them, monitor them, and they need to be an expert as well. And remember always that intake is really sales. Your job is taking a person and going through legal intake, and you can't call it sales in this marketplace like you can't call intake in the medical world sales as well. But really what you want to do is make sure that that person gets everything they possibly need in this environment to be able to become a client of yours. And technically that's sales. And so your intake manager is really a sales manager. And then you have to ask yourself, who is my intake manager? Is that a qualified person that should be doing that? Is that the right person in that position? Or do we need help here?
Yeah, and Tom, this is critical when we're talking about these class actions and you've got these folks that could be serving as a lead plaintiff, because this is their first interaction with what they view as your law firm. And so if they're talking to somebody there and they're not getting a great interaction because that person is distracted because they're a paralegal and admin, they've got a ton of other responsibilities, then they're going to be less likely to sign, because as everybody here knows, being a lead plaintiff does involve work. They're not just going to sign some paperwork and then walk away. No, they're going to be deposed. They're going to have a lot of questions being asked. And so getting this really positive first impression is going to be critical to having them be a successful lead plaintiff for your firm, for your case.
Thanks, Scott. So let's talk about the required intake skills. These are the skills that really needed to be a lawyer. Really aren't the same that it's needed to be an intake legal intake specialist. Now, it doesn't mean they don't overlap, and it may be the fact that when a lead plaintiff calls and they actually get the attorney on the phone, that's a perfect match. But in volume, or taking, it could be thousands of calls, your team needs to kind of be like this: train with empathy, legal terminology, knowledge of the litigation, phone etiquette, call control, which means they don't let. What you always don't want to do here is make sure that people spend 45 minutes telling their story you want to get them focused back to get through your screening criteria to know if you have a qualification or not. Being able to close that person basically on your, if necessary, on your law firm and how you can actually help them, meaning that you call the right place, we can help you, and making sure that's coming across all the time and all the terminology. To be able to technically be able to call them, text them, and email them, follow up for web leads and call leads that were not contacted or converted on the first call, be able to handle retainer execution with e-signing and the correct walkthrough to e-sign, warm and live transfers for call routing into multi-staff, all of those type of things, and as well as appointment scheduling. So that's a lot, right? So we're looking at a lot of things that go through training, with the number one most important thing being empathetic to their situation, and then having knowledge about what the litigation is. So you have to think about, do we have this inside, or do we need help with that as well? But it's a significant training process to bring an intake person in and keep them. So let's talk about qualifying leads and the screening criteria on the intake and how critical this is. So what we have found basically in dealing with multiple law firms and marketing firms and actually putting these packages together, is that the intake is going to change during phases of the case. So in pre-litigation, there's a wider open and looser criteria. It equals more cases coming in that require more screening. And then basically you generally can have even more fallout there, but that's actually generally what's happening in pre-litigation. During the litigation phase, you have ongoing knowledge, and that drives the intake criteria and starts to tighten up the intake criteria if you're still campaigning. And in late stage litigation, you have even tighter screening criteria. You have new class reps that are coming in. You've tightened up the screening criteria because you've learned from the pre-litigation and litigation phases. So in other words, you have to be nimble, or who you're working with has to be nimble to be able to change the intake as you need to change it, not keep doing the same thing all the way through the litigation.
Exactly. That's the thing, is when you've got these cases here, what was a good class rep when you filed this case may not be a good class rep as you're going through it. And so if you're working with Alert, you're working with me, then you're able to change that criteria and make sure that you are getting that ideal lead plaintiff. Because if that lead plaintiff that you had is suddenly disqualified, months or a year more in, then you need to be able to be nimble, as Tom said, and get the additional advertising, get people signed up and qualified.
Thank you. All right, so let's move through. So let's dial in the intake. Is your lead qualification process the same regardless of the time period? We just kind of talked about that. But using filters to stop law firms from being overwhelmed with non-quality cases is really what the point is. Focusing on cases that can generate revenue, customizing the intakes to each litigation and during the phases of the litigation. This is tightening up and improving the docket value with real cases. It frees up also staff and management time, not working on a lot of bogus cases when this is managed properly, and then being able to change as the intake as needed and the criteria. So yeah, go ahead, Scott.
This kind of, we got a question from Charles Thompson of victimlaw.com. He asked us, how do you feel about signing a potential class rep after settling a previous case in which he or she was also a class rep? And that's really going to boil down to that each individual law firm. The law firms are going to know who they can work with, who they can't. And Tom and I were discussing this, is that, on the mass tort side, you have people that will sit there and sign up with multiple law firms. And that just, obviously can't happen. So you want to make sure that you've got those questions asked throughout during the intake process. What's your take on that, Tom?
Yeah, so generally, it's very common as we go through the intake screening criteria when we're setting up any type of litigation to be able to handle these intakes and do the screening criteria, that we actually have several questions in there, or at least two questions. One is, have you talked to an attorney before about your case? Yes. Have you engaged with an attorney before with the case? If both of those are yes, that's an automatic disqualification usually, okay, in most cases. So building those in there are important. I think in this world, people that are out in late stage litigations trying to get into multiple different classes, or you could be even torts as well, what you're just trying to do, prevent them. And generally, if they are qualified, and if they've talked to an attorney and they're qualified, most of the time those attorneys have signed them. They're not just letting them go because they've already talked to them. So they generally become less and less of a quality lead if they said yes to either one of those questions. And often they're just screened out. So
yeah, exactly, because that's going to really potentially bite you in the butt if you've got that one person who is the lead plaintiff for 15 different types of TCPA class actions. And that's something that you want to make sure that you're asking in the intake process, as Tom mentioned. Otherwise, I'm sure that the defendant will find that out and will be bringing that up during the different hearings.
Thank you. So now we're going to talk about converting qualified leads to client on initial contact, and what you really need, which is really expert intake people as well as software systems. So let's just talk about lead response. Let's talk about what really matters. What we found really matters is that first, instant response to all leads 24/7, 365. That's the number one thing, is you have to have people be able to react now to leads coming in that are right now. And then on top of that, second, once you have them with you, stopping the shopping for qualified leads, and you do that with technology and 24/7 live intake. And so we'll get a little bit deeper into this. But simply, this is kind of the magic formula. And to say it is much easier than to actually do it 24/7. But 24/7 inbound calls are always answered in 3 rings or less, with hold times ever, if there is a hold time, under 15 seconds. And then web leads require instant outbound texts, calls, and emails at varied times of day with multiple attempts to improve lead conversions 2 times. We talked about 40% into live intake going to about 80%, and having the right intake and prompts there. And then once you have them, convert them to a signed client. So saying that, that's a mouthful, but saying that is much harder to do technology-wise and having people, especially when you wrap 24/7 around it. So let's do a little bit deeper dive into that. The goal for the initial call is to disqualify or convert to a client, not something really in between. So be responsive and build rapport is critical with a structured intake, meaning the intake is really built right for exactly what you want, and maintain call control so the call doesn't wander all over the place. And then qualify on the initial call or disqualify the lead. For qualified leads, do not break contact to send a retainer. Stay on the call. And the #1 highest conversion is staying on the call and texting retainers for e-sign. The second highest conversion is emailing retainers for e-sign. And the third highest conversions is mailing retainers for those not technically savvy or a demographic that really can't handle it for some reason, and following up with those. And then schedule follow-up meetings as necessary for all of these if they're ever sent but not signed. So getting in this focus of our goal is always to disqualify or convert. And that's kind of the way we're built here, but it's really the way you should be built unless you're dealing with a very difficult case. And what I would say is more difficult cases would be cases that really require screening criteria that is significantly more difficult. And I would say some of those type of cases are like sex abuse cases, but that's not probably what we're talking about today, but I'm just bringing that up to you. Those cases may take a second or third call to make sure you have the right person on the phone. So let's talk about converting qualified leads. If they demand to talk to an attorney before signing, we build systems around this, but you have to have really a transfer method and a reporting system around that to make sure. In our situation, what we do is we build a whole platform around this. So if they demand to talk to a lawyer before signing, then we can transfer that to the lawyer, and the lawyer can actually let us know what actually happened with that. And that accommodates these potential class reps when necessary because of the fact they want to do a deeper dive, but you don't want to let them go. So you put a method in place also in that situation where they get to another level of person within your law firm. And then use probing questions to find out why caller is hesitating to basically sign on board if there is a reason, to make sure you're ready to basically address all of the objections they may have to make them feel comfortable. So converting qualified leads, what do you do if your lead doesn't convert on the first call? Well, you have to ask yourself, what software system do you have to track leads? And then what system do you have to really schedule and automate tasks? So it's one thing to track a lead, meaning that if a lead goes into a CRM or any type of database, it's one thing, but then it sits there. So you've got to have a software system that actually then prompts you, say, hey, look, we talked to them at 10 this morning. We really need to call them back at 7 tonight. And then tomorrow I may have to call them at 9 in the morning, at 7 at night until we get to the weekend. We might finally reach them on the weekend. But unless your system is notifying you, you won't know where you're at. And then you have to end that task delivery method. Once you finally get on the call, terminate that, and then get back into the intake and qualification. So how do you contact them? We talked about this before. You can contact them by text, outbound calls, and emails. All three are really required. And then you have an option for mailing packets or, and how to address sent but not signed contracts, which means you track the mail. If you send a contract out, when it lands, your system automatically notifies you to call them because the contract landed. Let's talk about the contract. Let's get it out of the document. Let's walk through it. Let's get it signed, get it back into something that's already pre-addressed and paid for to mail back to make that all easy. And that all is tracked as well and measured. And also mailing packets for many demographics also improves conversions. So anytime you get into certain demographics, if you add that, we've seen that improve conversions about 15%, which is just huge numbers at volume by being able to mail on top of being able to text or email out for eSign. So what you need is software integration, tracking, tasking, varied time reaches, all of that improves conversions. And it's a significant system to actually put that in place. And you may ask yourself, well, is it easier just to use and maintain the standards we want with the intake, in-house intake specialist? Maybe on a small campaign, it might work for you to do that. But you have to ask yourself, what do you have? What type of system do you have to track and task these leads to make sure they're followed up with if nothing happens on the first call or if you don't reach them? Intake, we know can have major bandwidth issues. Even if you don't have any bandwidth issues, usually at 5 or 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock at night, you do. Weekends and holidays, you do. And that even just gets amplified when it's high volume. And with web leads, with outbound calls and trying to reach people and task and text them, it becomes a significant pile of tasks that need to be completed just to get them on the phone. So what type of system, once again, do you have to schedule and automate follow-up tasks? And remember, immediately reaction for inbound and outbound 24/7 is nearly impossible for most law firms to actually do this constantly with a constant flow that you don't turn off in bigger campaigns. So outsource the legal intake call center if you're going to outsource this and you're looking at outsourcing to help yourself out. That you have to check on them to make sure they have the right staffing, the right bandwidth, the right solutions, the right processes, the redundancies, contingencies to place to handle. And it's also something else that you have to research. And remember, the class action intake team is trained differently than the standard answering service. Obviously, intake for legal is way different than somebody just taking a voice message and taking a number for somebody to call back. You're trying to move them down the tracks to become a client on the very initial call. So the question becomes, when you look at all these things that you can do to improve conversions and should be doing, who are you marketing for? And the key is being marketing for you and not somebody else. So what superb intake does, it equals a strong marketing return on investment. So if there's a lack of internal and external outsourced bandwidth issue, that's going to result in lead loss, and that's going to lower your return on investment. Any slow lead response times results in lead loss and low conversions. We have studies from MIT, Harvard Business Study, as well as we just know that for sure from the data we have. Low intake quality results in lead loss or lower conversions. Weak tracking and tasking systems result in lower conversions. Inadequate intake managers always cause lower conversions because nobody's watching the floor of people taking the calls and helping them improve or making the changes necessary. And then weak intake screening criteria on the intake leads to much higher client fallout on the back end. So there's a lot of things to look at. How do we improve the marketing return on investment? So who are you marketing for? Well, remember that poor intake leads to marketing for other law firms, because once you create a lead, if you don't respond on a timely basis, they're just going to find somebody that will in their searches. Real easy to do it. And they're going to keep looking until they find somebody else that does it. So you end up marketing for other law firms. Once you actually ring that bell and you understand how expensive that is, the marketing spends are increasing, low return on investment, and a high cost per acquisition. And a lot of times we see that the marketing companies are blamed for what really is bad intake or not enough bandwidth. You end up with lower case retention, higher case fallout, and wasted internal resources and time working on bogus or weak cases, or just following up on stuff that you follow up too late. You're chasing stuff it's just too late to react to because you were never reacting quick enough in the first place. So what happens when you fix all your legal intake issues, meaning you plug all those holes and all those gaps, and what happens basically, you improve the return on investment. You end up with higher conversions, controlled and measured marketing costs, a lower cost per acquisition, and you free up marketing budgets to go after other campaigns or expand the campaign you're in. Or if you're on other practice types, to use that campaign for money for other things, to be efficient. So let's talk about campaign reporting and knowing where you stand. We basically just look at this, that what's really critical is CRM and case management integrations. We have a whole tech team. In fact, we have 17 people here building stuff for law firms. Integrations, how leads post, responding, measuring, pushing the leads and exporting and posting those into your system. And it kind of looks like this. So all lead sources, calls, web forms, email, social media, chat, doesn't really matter what it is. Those leads are all basically posted or emailed directly, and usually both of those. We post into a system and we email immediately after the intake is complete. All that data in the signed retainers is going into your CRM or your case management software and going to your staff automatically through email. So that's all happening at once as soon as the intake is complete. So you see what's happening live. And then that is actually integrated and pushed into all CRMs or case management software, wherever that can happen. That system just makes sure no leads lost and you see the data flowing all the time. Automated reports are also sent daily in campaigns. This shows daily campaign performance, shows total campaign performance, meaning that what has gone on for the entire duration of the campaign, measures the marketing source and the vendor, provides data to calculate total cost per acquisition, measures intake performance, triggers intake screening adjustments, provides detailed statuses, provides clarity decision-making tool, and removes campaign mysteries. So we think it's very important to provide reports. This is a detailed report, and it kind of shows you that on this given day, 5 leads were actually created, 2 new retainers were sent, nothing was signed that day, but for the entire campaign, 2,365 leads came in, 619 retainers were sent, and 510 were signed. And you can see down here all the statuses, so there's no mystery. Eyes are wide open for everybody. You can see how many were disqualified, how many the firm may have took over and signed because they wanted to talk to attorneys, had they already hired an attorney, they're ineligible to sign because maybe they're too young, or they're, let's say, that could be the reason right there. Or maybe they're not eligible to sign just because of the fact they may be related but not be the person qualified to sign by the law firm screening criteria. Mailed contracts and what were sent. So there's all these statuses are really critical. This goes out every single day. So there's never a mystery about what's happening to all the leads are flowing. Every single lead's being touched. That kind of covers that deep part of what it takes to match intake to marketing to really actually convert the most people into a class. Now, the other questions we've been asked is, well, what's going on during COVID-19? If you have 425 people and you're in 55,000 square feet, how do you pull that off during COVID-19? And the answer is well, we didn't. What we did basically about February 15th, there was meetings happening with our board of directors, and we made a decision to take 425 of our employees, and within about a 30-day period, because we have a really good IT team and a good tech team here that's pretty phenomenal, we're actually really proud of, pushed all those people home securely to protect them from COVID-19 and operating with 425 people in one building. They're all working at home now, and they're secure with firewalls and all the correct security on their computers as well to work at home. We actually thought our service level might go down, but this is actually a really good story. I think that, we did this in California, and like what you said, February 15th, when the decision was made. But what we found basically is that our service level did not go down. Our service level actually went up. And we actually believe the reason is for that is there's no jobs. So everybody wants to keep their job, which is really a motivator to keep doing their job. So we remain fairly operational. It was significant. I think, we just have a great tech team. Part of them came from the hospital environment, and they really know how to move people and actually protect them, both themselves, the security of the employees, and their safety, as well as our service to our clients. So we are maintaining at full level right now for intake. And the only other thing that's, I'll just tell a story here. The only thing that's been unique for us is that we were basically asked to actually make stick calls for the state of New York to schedule drive-through COVID-19 testing. We only do legal. We actually just elected to actually help them out because of the severity of what was going on there. That's actually over now, but we do want to let you know that we actually did step into that to help out on the COVID-19. I think it has to do with our training too, with the empathy and dealing with legal. So we felt well with actually helping people out there. So in conclusion, remember that marketing and lead generation is just part of the battle. The first responder with the very best intake wins, and this always results in the highest conversions. It's just that simple. So swift response times, trained intake specialists, solid technology systems are required to be really good at not wasting any marketing dollars and being efficient. And then ask yourself, can you do this all in-house 24/7? If not, consider outsourcing to a strong intake team for the highest conversions you can possibly get.
And Tom, how long have you guys been actually doing intake specifically just on the legal side of things?
Yeah, so we started our office open as a company in 1965, but about 7.5, 8 years ago, we decided to move completely out of every single field and only do legal intake, because we were training our people with empathy and psychology and call control, and taking calls for county governments and medical offices just didn't parlay. And there was a huge need in the legal market for people to act as intake to support law firms that would like to be an extension of the law firm, and that's all they do. So this is all we do now. So about the last 7 years, this is all we've done, and we work basically for many law firms with a focus on these type of class actions, mass torts, personal injury, and we work 24/7 in English and Spanish. So that's what we do.
Thanks, Tom.
No problem. Some of the questions here is, are your intake agents located in the USA? And the answer is yes. Spanish support, we already talked about. Does your technical team really collaborate with ours for integration for phone forwarding phones and web leads and posting criteria and integrations, as well as all of the CRM? The answer is yes. How about for case management software? Yep, we have a strong technical team. Do you have intake samples and provide intake coaching for various litigations? And the answer is yes. A lot of times we're working with people in samples and coaching the best way to make those intakes perform the best. And how does the pricing and billing work? It's really kind of customized based upon the mass tort or the class action or the case type you're doing. So we just need to talk to you, but we bill per the minute. We also have flat rates that we use. So we have to discuss that with you. And how long does setup take? The shortest setups, take us 2 to 3 days. The longest setups take, which are full-blown integrations of firms for everything that we're doing, usually take 10 to 15 business days, but usually it's around 5 days, and that business days. And then will you measure marketing firms to help figure out the cost per acquisition and help us work with those costs? And the answer is also we work with law firms a lot on those as well. So are there any other questions that came in?
Not right now. I think we've got them answered. If anybody has any questions, they can submit them now. And of course, Tom and I are available to answer any questions. Tom's information is right there. I'm s@topclassactions.com. So if you have any questions, submit those to Tom. Tom, thank you very much for presenting this information. It's been very helpful, and we really appreciate it. Colin from the Beard Group, thank you for putting this together and helping bring all of us here. Tom, is there anything you'd like to add before we end?
No, we appreciate you having me on. And if anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to really help you out. Just give us a call or email me and we can help you out and kind of walk you through the process, and we can go from there. But we appreciate basically you all listening in. If you have any more questions, feel free to contact us. And thank you for having us.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone who joined.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Awesome. Thanks, Colin.